let me tell you about two deaths. The first one happened 42,000 years ago. A 1-month-old mammoth calf, female, roughly the size of a large dog, slipped into a muddy river crossing somewhere in what is now Siberia. Her herd was moving. The adults couldn't reach her in time, or maybe they tried and couldn't. She panicked. She inhaled mud. And then she was gone. Her name, when we found her in 2007, was Lyuba. And when researchers put her through an industrial CT scanner, they found mammoth milk still sitting in her stomach. Her last meal, frozen for 42,000 years. The second death was quieter. No single moment, no body to find. Just a small herd of mammoths on a remote Arctic island getting smaller every generation, until one day, sometime around 4,000 years ago, while the Egyptians were building pyramids on the other side of the world, there simply weren't any left. No explosion, no meteor, no last stand, just silence, where there used to be something. Now here's the thing, in a laboratory in Dallas, Texas right now, a team of scientists is trying to undo both of those deaths. And the closer you look at what they're actually doing, and what they're actually bringing back, the more you realize this isn't really a story about science. It's a story about what we owe the things we've lost, and whether we're ready for the answer. To understand what's being resurrected, you first have to understand the world it came from. Because the woolly mammoth didn't just live in the Ice Age, it was the Ice Age. In the same way that a coral reef doesn't just live in the ocean, it is the ocean, in some fundamental sense. The ecosystem these animals dominated was called the Mammoth Steppe. And if you were somehow dropped into it right now, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the cold. It would be the size of the sky. No trees, no hills, tall enough to matter. Just flat, frozen grassland running to every horizon in every direction. A single continuous biome stretching from Spain to Alaska, stitched together across the top of the world, where the continents almost touched. The largest terrestrial ecosystem Earth has ever produced. And it was alive. Not the dead white silence people imagine when they think Ice Age, but a roaring, productive, crowded grassland, covered in artemisia and sedge and dwarf willow, grazed constantly by millions of animals whose hooves and bodies kept the whole system cycling. Then the wind would shift, and within about 30 seconds, your face would stop working. Minus 40 Celsius is not a number. It's a physical experience, the kind where your exhaled breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, and exposed skin starts to die in minutes. This was a normal Tuesday on the Mammoth Steppe. And somewhere in that wind, you'd start to hear something. A low, rhythmic percussion. The ground is transmitting it before the air does. Then you'd smell it. A thick animal musk, slightly sweet, slightly sharp, unlike anything alive today. And then you'd see them. A herd of 40 woolly mammoths moving across the plain, and the shoulder humps of the adults rising above the snow line like a row of boulders that have decided to walk. Here's the first thing popular culture got wrong. They weren't enormous. I mean, they were big. An adult male stood roughly 3 to 3.5 meters at the shoulder and weighed up to 8 tons. That's somewhere between a large African elephant and 2 pickup trucks stacked vertically. But they weren't the kaiju that movies imply. A full-grown mammoth bull was roughly the same height as a modern African elephant. The difference wasn't size, it was everything else. Because the woolly mammoth wasn't a cold-weather elephant. It was something closer to a completely different engineering solution to the problem of being large and warm-blooded in a place that wants to kill you. Start from the outside and work inward, the outer coat. Guard hairs up to 70 centimeters long, coarse and rope-like, hanging nearly to the ground like a living curtain. Underneath that, a dense, tightly curled undercoat that trapped warm air against the skin the way a down jacket traps air in its fibers. Underneath that, skin 2.5 centimeters thick, and underneath that, a continuous layer of body fat 10 centimeters deep. 4 inches of blubber on a land animal. in a grassland. Then there are the ears, 38 centimeters, the size of your forearm. An African elephant's ears are nearly 2 meters across. They're radiators designed to dump excess heat into the air. The mammoth's ears were ruthlessly compressed because every square centimeter of exposed surface was a leak in the heating system. Same with the tail. Only 21 vertebrae, capped with a flap of skin that folded down to cover and protect the animal's rear end from wind. Evolution had looked at every protrusion on the body and asked, does this need to be this big? And the answer was almost always no. And then there are the tusks. 4 meters long, 13 feet, 115 kilograms each, not combined, each one, curving down from the skull, sweeping outward, then spiraling inward so the tips crossed in front of the animal's face. 230 kilograms of curved bone that this animal carried in front of its head every day for decades. The spiral wasn't decorative, it was physics. The curve kept the center of mass close to the skull, reducing the torque on the neck to something manageable. Without that curve, the neck muscles required to hold those tusks up would have been physiologically impossible. With it, they became, simultaneously, the world's most effective snowplow and the world's most terrifying pair of weapons. Now, I need to stop here, because everything I've just described, the insulating coat, the compact ears, the engineering precision, it all contributes to a certain image. A large, gentle, somewhat majestic animal, a mascot, the Ice Age elephant that children put on their backpacks. I want to show you what was actually inside. In 2023, a team from the University of Michigan published a study in Nature that most people outside paleontology completely missed. They had taken a mammoth tusk and run a mass spectrometer across its growth layers, essentially reading the chemical record embedded in the ivory year by year, the way you read rings in a tree. And buried in those layers, they found something that rewrote the behavioral profile of the species entirely. Mammoth bulls went through annual cycles of musth. If you don't know that word, musth is a hormonal state in modern male elephants where testosterone levels increase to roughly 10 times their baseline concentration. The temporal glands on the sides of the head begin secreting a dark, foul-smelling liquid called temperin that runs down the face in visible streaks. The animal becomes unpredictable, aggressive, and single-mindedly focused on dominance and reproduction. Modern musth elephants have flipped cars, charged locomotives, killed other elephants 3 times their normal willingness to fight. Wildlife managers in regions with large elephant populations treat a musth male as a genuine public safety emergency. Now take that and put it inside 8 tons of animal with 4-meter tusks, in a frozen wilderness with no fences, no tranquilizer guns, and a resident population of cave lions that weighed 300 kilograms apiece. A woolly mammoth bull in musth was, without any real competition, the most dangerous animal on Earth. The cave lions knew it, the dire wolves knew it, the woolly rhinoceroses that shared the steppe knew it. The only creature that apparently didn't get the memo was Homo sapiens, because a 2024 study revised our understanding of how ancient humans hunted these animals. It wasn't thrown spears, it was planted pikes, stone-tipped spears driven into the ground at strategic angles, using the mammoth's own charging momentum to push the weapon through its body. They used the animal's power against it. Talk about nerve. I want to come back to Lyuba, because she's more than a discovery. She's the reason this entire conversation is possible. The permafrost beneath Siberia doesn't just preserve things, it preserves the moment of death. The exact configuration of cells at the exact second an animal stopped being alive. It's less like a freezer and more like a pause button, pressed 42,000 years ago, and only now being released. When scientists put Lyuba through a CT scanner, they weren't doing archaeology. They were doing something that shouldn't be possible. They could see the milk in her stomach. They could see the mud packed into her lungs and windpipe. And from the distribution of that mud, they could reconstruct what happened. She fell in during a river crossing. She struggled. The mud entered her airway before the water did. She drowned in silt, not water, which is slower and more frightening. And lactic acid bacteria that colonized her body afterward essentially pickled her from the inside out, sealing in everything that was there at the moment of death. 42,000 years, and we still found her milk. But Liuba isn't even the most significant specimen anymore. In November 2025, 18 months ago, researchers from Stockholm University published something that genuinely stopped the paleontology world. They had recovered intact RNA from a 40,000-year-old mammoth specimen found near the Laptov Sea coast, a young female known as Yucca. If DNA is the blueprint of a living thing, RNA is the active signal, the molecular record of which genes were switched on or off at a specific moment. The RNA recovered from Yucca's muscle tissue showed micromolecular stress responses, cellular distress markers firing in real time, preserved across 40 millennia. In other words, scientists read the fear in her cells, not metaphorically, literally. The molecular signature of extreme physiological stress, captured at the moment of death and held in suspension for 40,000 years until someone with the right equipment came along to read it. I don't know exactly how to sit with that information. I've been thinking about it since I first read the paper, and I still don't entirely know what to do with it. It feels like it crosses some kind of line. Not an ethical one exactly, but an existential one. Like the universe has a policy about the privacy of the dead, and we just quietly walked past it. Mammuthus primigenius had been alive for roughly 700,000 years. 700,000 years. Let that land for a second. Anatomically modern humans have existed for around 300,000. The entirety of recorded human civilization, from Sumer to smartphones, fits inside the last 5,000. The mammoth lineage was walking the earth for 140 times longer than civilization has existed. And they weren't just surviving, they were expanding. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into North America. They adapted to the European plains and the Siberian interior and the coastlines of what is now the North Sea, a region that was dry land then, connecting Britain to continental Europe, a vast populated grassland that is now 40 meters underwater. They survived ice ages advancing and retreating. They survived the extinctions of multiple competitor species. They survived volcanic winters and sea level changes of hundreds of meters. By every metric of evolutionary resilience, these animals were built to outlast almost anything. And for the most part, they did. When the Eurasian cave lions went extinct, the mammoths were still there. When the dire wolves disappeared from the fossil record, the mammoths were still there. 12,000 years ago, 10,000, 8,000, on St. Paul Island off the Alaskan coast, and on Wrangel Island in the high Arctic, a cold, remote refuge barely visible on most maps. A small population survived until approximately 4,000 years ago. They were there when the first pharaohs ruled Egypt. They were there when Stonehenge was being completed. And then they weren't. Sadly, and I mean that word in the most literal sense, not as a rhetorical device. There was no final battle, no dramatic last stand. The most likely reconstruction is simply that the last Wrangel Island population got smaller and smaller over generations, their habitat shrinking as the climate shifted, until the mathematics of small populations did what the mathematics of small populations always eventually does. The last mammoth probably died alone, old or young or sick, without knowing it was the last, without anything marking the moment as significant. The world just quietly became a different place. Here's what actually ended them, because the popular version of this story has been wrong for decades. The overkill hypothesis, humans hunted them to extinction, contains truth but isn't the full picture. A 2021 analysis of environmental DNA extracted from Arctic sediment cores, published in Nature, reframed the cause of death entirely. Researchers pulled ancient DNA from layers of sediment going back tens of thousands of years, tracking not just mammoth DNA, but the full plant community of the Mammoth Steppe. And what they found was that the mammoth's real killer wasn't a spear. It was a transformation. As the climate warmed at the end of the last ice age, the Mammoth Steppe, that vast, dry, productive grassland, started dying. Gradually, the permafrost softened in some regions and turned solid ground into bog. The dry grass and artemisia that mammoths were built to eat was replaced by wet moss, an encroaching conifer forest, and an 8-ton animal that needed firm ground to walk on, and hundreds of kilograms of high-protein grass per day found its entire world slowly converting into something it couldn't use. To put that in perspective, imagine every food source you rely on being replaced over the course of a few thousand years with food that technically looks similar but your body can't process. You're not starving dramatically. You're just slowly, generationally, running out of the thing you need. Your population doesn't collapse. It contracts and contracts and contracts. Human hunters didn't so much kill the mammoth as arrive at the end of a long illness and administer the final blow, which doesn't make us innocent, but it does make the story more complicated and more honest than the simple, "we hunted them to death" version. The last 8-ton remnants of a 700,000-year dynasty, reduced to a handful of individuals on a remote Arctic island, dying out in the same geological eye blink that produced the Bronze Age and the first written language. Not with a bang, with a silence. And this brings us to Dallas. Colossal Biosciences was founded by entrepreneur Ben Lamb and Harvard geneticist George Church. It's currently valued at around $10 billion. And its stated goal, but the one printed on the website, the one they've raised that money to pursue, is to have a living woolly mammoth by 2028. I want to be honest with you about how I feel about that sentence, because I've spent a lot of time with this material, and I genuinely don't know whether that goal is the most inspiring thing I've ever heard or the most reckless, possibly both. Here's what they're actually doing, because the word cloning keeps appearing in headlines, and it's not accurate. The DNA preserved in frozen mammoth specimens is shattered, fragmented into millions of unusable pieces by thousands of years of slow molecular decay. You can sequence it, read it, study it, but you can't use it as a template for a living cell. What Colossal is doing instead is using CRISPR gene editing to modify the genome of the Asian elephant, which shares 99.6% of its DNA with the woolly mammoth. They're identifying the specific gene variants responsible for mammoth traits. The thick hair, the cold-adapted hemoglobin that keeps blood oxygenated at extreme temperatures, the lipid metabolism that builds the deep fat reserves, and inserting approximately 65 of those gene combinations into elephant cells. They're not building a mammoth, they're converting an elephant into one gene by gene, until the result is something that has never existed before. Not a mammoth, not an elephant, something in between, something new, wearing an ancient shape. And in 2024 and 2025, they proved the underlying approach works. They created woolly mice, ordinary lab mice with mammoth cold tolerance genes inserted, which then grew thick, mammoth textured coats and developed significantly improved cold resistance. The mice gestated in 20 days. A mammoth will take 22 months. But the proof of concept exists now, in a cage, in a lab, running on a wheel. Now here's the part that I find simultaneously the most compelling and the most unsettling argument for doing this. Sergei Zimov is a Russian ecologist who has spent decades at a research station in northeastern Siberia. His theory, called the Pleistocene Park hypothesis, is that the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem can be partially restored, and that restoring it might be one of the most significant climate interventions available to us. The permafrost beneath the Arctic contains an estimated 1.6 trillion tons of carbon and methane, more greenhouse gas than the entire atmosphere currently holds. As global temperatures rise, that permafrost thaws, releases those gases, and accelerates warming in a feedback loop that has no natural break. It is, in the vocabulary of climate science, a tipping point. One of the ones that keeps researchers up at night. But Zimov noticed something in his decades of fieldwork. In areas where large herds of heavy animals still move and graze and trample the ground, the snowpack is compressed and broken up, and snow acts as insulation. It traps the relatively warmer autumn air against the soil and slows the penetration of winter cold. When large animals break that snowpack, winter air at -50°C reaches the soil directly, keeping it frozen. His experimental preserve showed soil temperatures several degrees colder under grazed land than under undisturbed tundra. In other words, a herd of 8-ton mammoths moving across the Siberian permafrost, doing nothing more than what mammoths have always done, could potentially slow the thawing of the Arctic more effectively than almost any technology we currently possess. Their footsteps. Literally, physically, 8 tons of footsteps pressing down on snow, as a climate intervention. I told you I didn't know whether this was inspiring or reckless. I still don't. Because the Zimov argument is the strongest case for bringing the mammoth back that I've encountered. And it's also the argument that scares me most. Because it means we wouldn't be creating a zoo exhibit. We'd be creating an ecosystem engineer. And ecosystem engineers don't stay where you put them. So here's where we are. 42,000 years ago, a baby mammoth inhaled mud and died, and was preserved so perfectly that last year we could read the molecular distress signals in her muscle tissue. 4,000 years ago, the last members of a species that had survived for 700,000 years quietly disappeared from an Arctic island while the pyramids were still standing. And right now in Dallas, a team of scientists is inserting 70-million-year-old genetic information into elephant cells and watching what grows. We are living, genuinely, at the hinge point of this story. The moment where the long silence after the second death is either going to continue or end. Whether what comes out of that Dallas lab in 2028 is a mammoth, or an elephant in a mammoth costume, or something that has no name yet, I honestly don't know, but I know this. The question of whether we should do it is not a scientific question. It's a question about what we believe we owe to the things we've lost, and what we're willing to be responsible for going forward. And most people don't even know the question is being asked. So I'll ask you directly, should we bring it back? Not as a thought experiment, as a real vote. Leave it in the comments, yes, no, or the answer I suspect a lot of people will give, which is, I need to think about it. Because that answer, honestly, might be the most honest one